we've actually had 50 years of unusually stable weather. As a result of this, gardeners and farmers by and large have got used to gardening in what I call good times, good time gardening. Now we're in a period of climate change and we have much more unstable weather. What do we need now to be able to garden in times that are less predictable?
Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. I'm in Corvallis, Oregon with a plant breeder. I'm with Carol Debbie. Thanks for joining me.
Glad to be with you.
Well, let me tell you about this woman. Carol specializes in developing public domain crops, we'll talk about that, for organic growing conditions, for sustainable agriculture and human survival. Sounds like Peak Moment, doesn't it? She's a PhD in biology from Harvard University and has been experimenting with crops and gardening in Corvallis since 1979. So her books include, among others, this one, The Resilient Gardener, Food Production and Self-Reliance in Uncertain Times, including the 5 crops you need to survive and thrive: potatoes, corn, beans, squash, and eggs. That sounds so good. And we will talk about that. And the Tao of Vegetable Gardening, cultivating tomatoes, greens, peas, beans, squash, joy, and serenity. Those last two sound very yummy. As well as your earlier book on, I'll get this, didn't have it here.
Breed your own vegetable varieties.
Right.
The Gardener's and Farmer's Guide to Plant Breeding and Seed Saving.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got the whole works. Well, tell me, I am not a gardener, so I was rather surprised and delighted in The Resilient Gardener to have you cover all kinds of details that made it feel not as formidable to me. And part of it is, you start with the perspective of it has to taste good, because you're a foodie and a gardener. And also, you looked at how to do things that take less energy, less resources, that are going to work in times where we need to be resilient. So I'm going to ask you to start with telling us, what do you mean by resilient for a resilient gardener?
Okay. Just to start with, one thing you mentioned was some people really actually enjoy working really hard in the garden. I don't. I would much rather just be able to sow my seeds and come back and harvest. So when I breed crops or when I experiment with gardening methods, I'm always after, how do I get the most food, the most delicious food, for the absolute least possible work.
Yes, yes, yes.
The resilience thing, I think so many gardeners these days, we basically, up until just the last few years, we've had one kind of weather. We've actually had 50 years of unusually stable weather. As a result of this, gardeners and farmers by and large have got used to gardening in what I call good times, good time gardening. That's actually not what we need when you look at larger scale times. 1,000 years, how many periods do we have where there's 50 years of almost always good weather? No, not really. And now we're in a period of climate change and we have much more unstable weather. And it's not necessarily that your backyard is going to be warmer, for example, because it may be colder or wetter, or it all depends upon how the overall wind patterns and the overall planetary weather patterns shift. But whatever else, your backyard and your garden are a whole lot less stable than they used to be. It's a lot less predictable, and being able to garden or farm in any given region has a whole lot to do with the predictability of what your weather is going to be like. That is all changing now. So, what do we need now to be able to garden in times that are less predictable? And to figure that out, one of the things I looked at was what people discovered in the Little Ice Age, because all of a sudden, essentially, one spring, they were in a completely different weather pattern.
In the Little Ice Age,
yeah,
1700s,
in Europe as well as in North America. It started raining and it basically didn't stop. And it was colder and it stayed colder and more predictable. Peasants in Europe had been just grain farmers. Grain was a bad thing to grow because it was no longer reliable because it's got these big heavy heads that lodge if you get a storm and just fall to the ground and rot. So all of a sudden in the Little Ice Age, European farmers had to learn to farm differently. And those are actually the patterns that we brought with us as pioneers to this country. And we lost them when we came into this period of great stability. So when you look at that historical situation, you see, well, one of the things is you grow a whole lot of different crops. You don't depend upon just one food. Because even at best, whole crops can fail, so you want other crops. Another thing is that you try to have gardening or farming patterns that vary from the time of year. So say here in Maritime Oregon, I can grow the ordinary summer beans that are the common beans, but I can also grow fava beans over the winter. So if some disaster happens at one time of year, some of my crops are not even dependent upon that time of year. Another approach that I suggest to people is if you're dealing with unstable times, short season crops are a real premium. For the maximum production, you usually want a crop that's full season for your area. So you would have a corn, for example, where you put in the ground as early as possible and you harvest at the last minute. That's fine if everything's stable and if the as early as possible and the last minute are reproducible from year to year. Try to do that now, not so good. So with respect to my own breeding and growing of corn and beans especially, for example, I've really focused on short season varieties. So put it in the ground in the spring, some sort of disaster happens, you can replant, still get a crop. Up until this last summer, the 4 summers before that, we had unusually cold weather. Well, because of the fact that I was growing and developing short season corns. They just took longer, but they still matured just fine. If I had instead been focusing on long season varieties, I'd have been out of luck. They wouldn't have matured. Likewise, if you have a disaster at the end of the season, it doesn't matter because your short season crop is already out of the ground by then. So there's just much to be said for short season crops. And if you're a commercial farmer, I suggest you do a mix. You do some full season crops in case you got a good year. You do some short season crops in case your full season crops don't, they bite the dust. I think if you're planting trees, fruit trees for example, one of the things you have to take into account is you don't really care about the average freeze in the winter. What you care about, because the trees, in order to be successful, they've got to make it through the really rotten year too. So a lot of people will say, well, now with global warming, you can experiment planting fruit trees that are adapted for a zone that's warmer than where you were. And I say nonsense. Go in the other direction you want to, because now we can have greater extremes.
Right,
so
right.
Even though we might have warmer weather on average, the average does not matter. What matters is the lows or the highs,
Right,
depending on what you're talking about. So I suggest that people be more conservative than ever with respect to growing fruit trees. And on the other hand, when it comes to the annual vegetables, play, experiment. Go ahead and try things that are in the past. If you're actually experimenting in your or experiencing in your own backyard warmer weather, go ahead and plant some stuff that is warm weather adapted. Greater variability and unpredictability of the weather patterns matters a whole lot more. One other thing I would suggest is that when it comes to the balance between garden crops that you sow seed as opposed to transplants, there's much more of a premium now on using transplanting, because if you've got your crops are tucked away in a greenhouse for the first month,
You've got to start.
that gives you some leeway.
Yes, yes.
So if you get something rotten happen during that whole period,
you're covered because you've got
Still
them
covered, right.
happily in the greenhouse. Yeah, I've seen a lot of greenhouses as we've traveled here in the Northwest. It looks like it's, and simple ones, so little hoop houses that can be lifted quickly to extend the season, really, to get started sooner.
Well, two other things I'd mention with respect to the overall issue of resilience is minimum inputs. You're better off finding varieties or creating varieties if you're into plant breeding and adapting varieties to your own conditions. You're better off developing varieties that don't require really serious inputs, that can get by on relatively minimal inputs. Because if you had a real disaster hit, like the next Mega 9 earthquake or something, you could be cut off.
So you're not going to get the fertilizer that you need,
and you might not get seed. So that's the other thing that I would suggest is that either learn seed saving and start saving some of your own seed, or if you don't want to do that, hoard seed. Everybody talks about seed saving, but you don't have to save the seed in the good years when you can buy seed. Instead, if you simply learn how to dry it properly and freeze it, you have to dry it properly because most seed is too wet to freeze when it comes from the seed companies. So you dry it a little bit extra in a dehydrator, and then you freeze it. So you've got a stash put away, and you can just forget about it. And then if something bad happens, you can start saving the seed. As long as you've got the seed, if you've got a stash of seed, you can start saving it at that point. Just tuck a book on seed saving away too.
Well,
you might have to
including
learn
your
it
own.
on the fly, right? You might have to learn it on the fly.
But what you're talking about really is security. I hear that everywhere. That resilience is about having, duplications and redundancy, so that you have the security of having that.
One of the things I always think in terms of, and I suggest, two things. One is, don't think in terms of just the next year or even your own life. Think in terms of the next 1,000 years. Because this gives you kind of perspective for the sort of things that happen to people. And gardeners and small farmers are frequently the people that get us through
That's right.
those times. Times of war, for example, victory gardens, they're part of what kept people going. In order to have functional gardens in really bad times, Mega 9 earthquakes, one or two of them every 1,000 years. The next time that happens in Oregon, we aren't going to have any bridges or roads.
It's true. Yeah.
Well, thinking of that, I can say to myself, okay, I want us to have lots of gardens. I want everybody to have their own do-it-yourself seed bank tucked away in their freezer, and know how to save seed, and have enough seeds so that, and this is the other thing I always mention, think in long terms to help yourself understand what are the kinds of things human beings have to deal with, and what's the role of gardeners in helping humanity survive through all of these things. But then the second thing is, it has to be not just yourself and your family you're thinking of. You've got to, at the very least, be thinking of your community, your neighborhood, because if you're in a situation where suddenly something has happened, it could be something small, just your family runs out of money or nobody has a job or whatever, so all of a sudden you're really dependent on your garden. But if it's some bigger thing that affects your whole region or your whole city or neighborhood, you've got to be in a situation where you have got enough seed that you can share with neighbors, because it's not going to do you a whole lot of good to be the only person with a garden in the neighborhood. You know, lots of luck harvesting anything out of that if you're
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. So if you have everybody,
You know, you
growing.
cannot easily store enough food to feed your whole neighborhood,
Yeah.
but you can really easily store enough seed to supply planting seed for your whole neighborhood.
grand.
Yeah.
Woo, I think that's a primo idea.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, I'm going to jump over to your five, the 5 crops you need to survive and thrive, because you've worked at developing those breeds that with many of the qualities that you've talked about.
Some of them.
Season, some of them as well.
Haven't bought any potatoes, but why those crops?
Yeah, why those crops? And you
Well-
eggs and you love ducks, but let's talk about the
Yeah.
crops in particular.
Right. The ones I've worked on breeding myself are the corn, beans, and squash. So let me start with potatoes and talk about why that has to be part of the list. Potatoes, practically speaking, are actually just a wet grain. They have got a very high protein content as well as a high carbohydrate content. They're very easy to grow on a backyard or small farm scale. If you had to dig up your backyard and turn it into a wheat patch, lots of luck, because you need a fine seed bed for a wheat patch. You basically need what amounts to a tractor. With potatoes, all you really need is a shovel. You can go and strip the sod off and make a potato bed, and there you go. They don't require a whole lot of fertility. They yield more calories, more carbohydrate per unit space than any other crop, if you're talking about temperate zone.
Uh-huh.
Now here's the surprise. They yield more protein per unit space than any other crop. It's comparable to beans, really,
Wow.
because so people don't quite realize this, because we talk about protein with respect to grains, and 18% is really high. You know, the wheats run all the way from 10% or so to 18%. So even the wheats that have got the most protein in them, talking about 18% or so. Well, that's basically on a dry weight basis. Potatoes, you're talking about, say, 2%. But most of that is water. If you're talking about the actual food part, you're right up there close to where wheat is. The better, higher protein varieties of wheat. And furthermore, the protein that's in the potatoes is better balanced and it's more digestible, whereas the wheat protein is not as easy to digest.
Right, for all of us.
So,
All of us. Yes.
so if a person were eating just proteins, or just potatoes as their main diet, the ratio of calories and protein is actually so well balanced that it's actually would be all the protein that many people would need. If you're talking about people that are actually laboring pretty hard, so they're eating more like 3,000 to 5,000 calories a day, it's way more protein than they actually need. So this is why in the days before the potato famine, the Irish peasants and European peasants in general were depending so heavily on the potato. It gave them virtually everything they needed. You toss in a few garden greens, a little bit of milk, you got the situation covered.
Wow, great.
So it's absolutely wonderful food. There's all kinds of different flavors. You can store. The disadvantage to potatoes is you can't store them for more than, you can store them in a climate like this. An attached garage, we stored potatoes right through spring. But that's about it.
Yeah, you can't.
And that's good storing varieties. So the other crops that I deal with, the squash again is another thing that usually you're going to be able to store good storing types through spring. The corn and beans, you can keep those for more than a year. And there are times when you look over periods of 1,000 years, there's times where, not only in specific regions, but even looking on the world basis, where nobody could do agriculture successfully at all for a period of a few years. There was a period, I think it was 500 or something AD. People have looked at tree rings, and basically the trees quit growing all over the world. People have not totally figured out why. They think some volcano blew up big time at that point. When they look back at records from some civilizations, like the Japanese and the Chinese, for example, that have records that go that far back, people were saying things like, the sun is red all day, it's only out for a few hours and gives no heat. Can you imagine what that was like? And this is just in the last couple thousand years. So I think that if you're thinking in terms of trying to, fulfill your full role as a gardener or a small farmer and try to help your family and your neighborhood survive all the sorts of things that can happen, when you look at these bigger ranges of time, you see sometimes there's no food production for years. So that's where the beans and the grains come in, because those you can, if you grow them yourself, you can have a backlog so that you've not only got enough seed to grow the next year's crop, and enough seed for your whole neighborhood to be able to plant all of their lawns in grain, but you can backlog enough of those. And with the squash and the potatoes, they extend your harvest many months when you know how to store them. But you really need the grains and the grain legumes in order to take you over the threshold where you just have crop failures. The Hopi Indians had a tradition that in a year that they had a harvest, they tried to put away enough seed for 2 years at the very least.
Smart.
They had plenty of years in which they didn't get a crop. So they needed to have at least seed, enough seed to
Plant,
put away.
Yes.
And I think we need to think in those kind of terms. So grain and grain legumes. Well, the beans are really easy. The dried beans are really easy. When it comes to grains, one of the reasons for focusing on corn is that of all of the grains, it's the one that's the easiest to grow on the backyard scale with just simple hand tools. With the small grains, basically you need fine seed beds. That means you need a tractor or tillage, or at least a rototiller. You can't just go and easily convert a lawn into a fine seed bed
for wheat or oats or
Right.
barley.
Whereas corn, the Indians grew fine corn crops with nothing but what amounted to a hoe, which was like what I call the peasant hoe, but it was made from a shoulder blade of a bison or an antelope, mounted on a stick. So that was their hoe. And they had a digging stick. And, they could dig up a patch and plant the corn in hills. That's partly the reason why they were planting corn in the hills all the time, was they didn't have tillage equipment. So they couldn't plant, a solid field the way the pioneers were.
In a sense, they
So
distributed
they would just dig up a little hole,
Uh-huh.
and then skip 2 yards, and dig up another little hole, and make little hills. So corn is the easy thing to grow on a backyard scale, and if you need to, just that year, because something has happened, you need to suddenly turn a whole bunch of lawns into food patches, corn would be absolutely the easiest thing to do.
Fabulous, yes.
Beans are very easy to do too, as long as you've got, varieties that are suitable for your area.
Speaking of which, varieties here in our last minute about that we have, that's what you do, is you breed for particular, so tell us, and in addition, so I want to know what your seed company name is so that people can find you.
Fertile Valley Seeds.
Fertile Valley Seeds.
Right, yeah.
Yes, and your website.
It's www.caroldeppy.com.
With 2 P's.
Yes.
CAROL Yes, thank you.
Fertile Valley is after Willamette Valley, but it's also an illusion. It's a Taoist illusion. The Fertile Valley is the source of creativity and bounty that flows over to the rest of the land.
And I want to have you just give a word here, is that you're doing open source. What does that mean in your seeds?
They're open pollinated public domain varieties.
Thank
You
you.
can take the seed and you can do anything you want with it. You can use it to breed other things, you can grow it and sell it yourself. It's,
So what I see it is, it's your gift to the world, really.
yeah.
Is the work that you are doing. So part of how you make a living at this is selling the seeds. And yet you're
Yeah.
giving them away in a sense also.
And so there's all kinds of ways that you could grow seeds that would probably be more profitable. But I think one of the big difficulties has been the conversion in the last few decades of what was a public heritage into private germplasm that's it's either hybrids, so you have to do a lot of work in order to pull new varieties out to get anywhere that doesn't breed true, or it's patented or plant variety protected so that you're legally forbidden to fully possess and do what you want with the seed. So I feel very strongly about the heritage of people owning the food germplasm. So I'm one of we're always small-scale plant breeders who basically does the opposite of what all the big seed companies, and at this point what most of the university professors are doing, and that is deliberately breeding varieties that we release fully as public domain material.
I want to say for everyone.
For everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And those who do that. And thank you for this conversation.
It's been fun.
Rich. You're watching Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. I'm with Carol Deppy, who's a woman who's thinking beyond 1,000 years and having us all be fed. Join us next time.